Question to make. When you're talking about the polar caps and the idea of transpiration, did you mean sublimation of the ice? No, that's not what I meant. Transpiration would occur because there would be a sudden explosion of energy that would completely drain the water from the existing life in that area, you see. Are you talking about people? Yes. Oh my God. So you're saying that people in the area of the poles would experience a loss of their liquid basis. It would be like suddenly drying out, or what? No, not in that sense, dear. The transpiration from the plants is a normal process. However, the transpiration from individuals also occurs. It just occurs in a little different way because they have a cellular construction that allows the sweat glands to evacuate the moisture that is necessary to provide for the drying out of the external structure of the individual. And so the sweat glands will produce moisture to combat the effect of the evaporation of the moisture from the skin, you see. And so that's why you sweat when you work out hard, because the moisture is evaporating. So transpiration is a way of drawing from the organism a vapor that will replace the lost vapor or humidity in the air, you see. Well, they always say that when it's very humid and very hot, that it's harder on the human being, not when it's a dry heat. The humidity in the air will cause the process of replacement of the essential hydration to be compromised, because the humidity will cause the lack of evaporation. And so because there's a lack of evaporation, there will be an inability to protect the base temperature, because as the temperature rises, the organism protects itself and its necessary temperate zone, you might say, through the release of the extra liquid that must be cooled, you see, because that's one of the ways the body cools down, is by letting go of this excess moisture. And so when it's really humid, the process becomes more difficult because the excess moisture cannot be exuded into the air because it's already laden with moisture. And so there is a compromise in the ability to release that moisture. When the air is very dry, there is a tendency to need to relieve the tension that is created by the heat through the process of sweating, and evaporation and transpiration will occur as a necessary adjunct to this process. So you won't experience it as sweat, you will experience it as dryness. When you are in the heat, if your skin feels dry, the moisture is being pulled out of your skin, right? Yes, I've experienced that in the winter when the heat comes on. Right. Because the air will try to achieve a certain balance of its own as far as moisture content. And so it will help to pull the moisture out of your body through transpiration. So you won't sweat, you'll just get dry. And the membranes in your nose may get dry, which will induce what many people refer to as a cold, because the irritated membranes are a opportunity for opportunistic viruses, you see. Now, when the magnetic poles reverse, there will be a tendency for the air to become very, very dry around the poles, because the magnetic forces will destroy the usual freezing and melting process, so that the air will become quite dry in those areas, and there will be a lot of transpiration that takes place from the vegetation and any animals or humans that are in that location. So you could expect them to feel very, very dehydrated. And it doesn't mean that we'll suck the life out of them. It just means that they will feel very dehydrated. And that will cause them to think that they need to consume more liquids. And so they'll look for more liquids. And the problem will be that there will be a temporary hold on the melting cycles at the poles. So rather than melting faster, they will cease to melt at all. And that will cause a deprivation of fresh water because the melting ice provides a lot of fresh water for those regions. And the lack of melting ice will result in the inability to quench the thirst except through the liquid that is already on hand. And so there will be sufficient liquid for most people, but some will find it very hard to quench their thirst. And that will burst their bubble, you see, because they'll say, what's going on here? Why is this happening to us? So it's not like it would be a sudden, all of a sudden all the ice melts or all this. It just would interrupt the melting freezing cycle for a few years, or not even that long. The rate of melt would increase exponentially after the poles begin to shift through the equator, because they don't just automatically reverse, you see, dear. They shift. So the magnetic poles will shift through the Earth, you see. So when the magnetic poles reach the equator in their migration, they will result in a lot of precipitation there. That will result in a lot of cold air that will eventually appear as snow, and it will snow around the equator because of the transferal of the energy through the access to a different reality is the best way that I can say it. Okay, so if this happens where I guess you wouldn't say if, you would say when this happens, what happens when the poles shift across the mid-latitudes? The shift of the magnetic poles across the mid-latitudes will result in a lot of disruption of the climate, you see. However, it would not be as painful as it will be for the ones who live in the northern latitudes or at the equator, because those latitudes are already adjusted to the magnetic poles as they are. And so they would have a big shock because the way the magnetic levels exist is sort of like a transparent canopy over the earth. And so as the poles shift and they move through the mid-latitudes would see something more like the northern lights overhead, and they would experience some change in the magnetic north, of course, and magnetic south, but the main problems for them would only be very temporary, and they would have to do with the shifting of the native instincts of the animals and the vegetation even, and the humans. And therefore, you might feel very disoriented for a while, simply because it would be like saying that you had a big ringing in your ears because you couldn't figure out the different vibrations you see. Sort of like when you get in an airplane and you fly high and you have that ringing in your ears or the stuffed up feeling in your ears because your physical body has to adjust to the change. So your body would quickly adjust to the changes, and there shouldn't be a big difficulty for the world at the mid latitudes. However, it would be a big change for those at the equator because the disorientation would be extreme. And so they could expect a lot of energy that would twist their world around, and they wouldn't be prepared for it. In the mid latitudes like North Dakota, you're not surprised by differences in weather patterns from winter to summer, etc. And so you can adjust to snow or rain or sunshine. However, they would not be prepared for the cold rains and snow that would occur. And eventually, the poles will wander all the way to the opposite ends, of course, and that I anticipate would take about 3 years. I think that was about right. Some say it takes hundreds of years, but I say it does not. And so we'll find out who's right, won't we? And so once this flip or reversal is complete, then there will be a new worldview because people will say, what happened today? What happened today? What happened today? Because they won't be able to figure it out. Because by that time, they will be so confused anyway by the way the world has refused to behave in the familiar way that they will just see it as one more anomaly that can't be explained. It's just another change that cannot be explained. There will be scientists, of course, who will understand what is happening. However, by then, their voices will be drowned out by the people who are convinced that it is the end of the world and that they must run about and shout and say, it's the end of the world. God, take me today to the promised land. And so you will already understand it's coming, so you won't be so surprised in your community because you'll have talked about it for quite a while and prepared yourself for this eventuality. However, you might compare this to a event like a total eclipse of the sun, where the people will run and say, oh my God, the gods are angry, because they don't understand how it works. They don't understand about eclipses of the sun. And they will not understand what is happening at that day because they have no trust on the scientists, you see, because they have been thoroughly punished in their society for trust on science, because the ones who trust on the steeple will be running amok. They'll just be running amok, and they'll be killing anybody who dares to say that they deserve what they get. They'll just kill them. And they'll say, we'll take your food and tell you that you deserve what you got. And that's okay because everyone goes to heaven, right? But God has promised to protect your community from this eventuality. And so those people who have prepared and who have come back to an awareness of God energy and written God back into the formula will not be lost in the rising sea, as we call it. They will survive and they will create the new nation under God. And they will not have to be punished by the ones who run amok because they've already turned to God and God has led them already to the promised land that He promised them. He promised them that one day He would help them find the Garden of Eden again. And of course, in order to find the Garden of Eden, they had to be willing to understand the Trinity. They had to understand their own responsibility and their own capacity for growth, you see, because it is the evolutionary point of humanity. This is the evolutionary point of humanity when they will learn that evolution is not a matter of competition, it is a matter of cooperation. And those who can operate together, who can cooperate, will survive because they will not be like the unschooled people who run around screaming and say, oh my God, it's the end of the world because there's an eclipse today, because the sun was taken away by the evil spirits, you see, and now we have to kill each other because we don't know which ones are the evil ones, so we better kill them all until we're the only one that remains. And then at that point, we'll have killed all our friends and our neighbors, so there won't be much point for the last man standing in that society to continue, you see. Whereas those who have already prepared will be gently set down in the new reality where they will continue to work and play in the same way to which they have become acclimated through their trust on God, you see? Makes sense now? Yes, it makes better sense than before. I couldn't quite understand it. I had to look up transpiration because I didn't know what that meant. Well, that's what it means. So let's move on, dear. Go take your walk, and later we can talk. Okay, thank you, Mr. Reimann.